The relevance of South-South cooperation in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and other global development agendas is growing. This is leading to increased interest in measuring and monitoring the contribution of this cooperation to development effectiveness. The benefits of doing this are now well recognized. Countries in the Global South clearly want better information and data, improve effectiveness, explore synergies with other development resources, and for accountability to diverse stakeholders. But there is no consensus yet on how to measure and monitor South-South cooperation. Countries, for one thing, are using different technical and political approaches. This is further complicated by the many different forms of cooperation among countries, making transparency and accountability harder to realize. The challenge is to build a common framework for monitoring and evaluation. Doing this will help ensure comparability among providers, easier access to data, and clearer evidence on what is contributing to development effectiveness and what is not, and why. This session will discuss the approaches and the challenges to current monitoring and evaluation frameworks for South-South cooperation. It will explore the assessment exercises of case countries to develop their own evaluation frameworks to better understand the impact of their South-South cooperation efforts.
The video provided us with a very nice introduction to the session, so I don't have to do that. I'll just briefly introduce our panel. You have the bios in the packets that were passed out to everyone. First, we have Nesan Besharati, who is a Senior Research Fellow, Institute for Global Dialogue, and also from the BRICS Policy Center. Nesan wears many hats. He's also a member of the Network for Southern Think Tanks. Emmanuel Jimenez, Manny, is the Executive Director and one of our collaborating partners as well from the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3IE. My longtime friend Taejong Kim, who we heard from a little bit earlier, KDI School of Public Policy and Management. We have Professor Ju-Won Oh, who's from Seoul National University College of Medicine. Another former colleague of mine, Jo Tae-dong, who is the head of the Global Development Research Division for Center for International Knowledge on Development from China. And Farzana Ahmed, who is the lead evaluation specialist from the Independent Evaluation Department of the ADB. So I'm Anthea Molokala from the Asia Foundation. We have a lot of panelists with a lot of experience to share, so the challenge is always trying to capture that information in a short session and for panelists to keep their remarks succinct. We're going to help you out a little bit. I'm reminding everyone that we have several rounds of questioning, but the answers will be about 2 minutes each. My colleague, Kyung-sun, is there to give short reminders to everyone. If you get very exuberant and excited about your topic, she will give you a 30-second reminder when you're almost to the 2-minute mark point. So we have several rounds. First, we're going to we're getting much deeper now. We talked about South-South knowledge sharing in general in the first session, and now we're getting deeper to look at how do you actually evaluate it. So in the first round of questions, I want to look at what does South-South evaluation actually look like? Nesan, I'm going to turn to you first. So the Network of Southern Think Tanks that I mentioned earlier has been working on for a few years now on evaluation frameworks for South-South cooperation. And I know that you were intimately involved in that process. As a result of that work, did you find, or was one of the findings of that work that there is a distinctly or a unique Southern approach to evaluation that may be different from traditional North-South evaluation? And to what extent did the framework that NEST came up with, to what extent did it draw on traditional evaluation techniques?
Thank you, Antea. Before I answer the fairly complex question, I just want to greet everybody. I'm probably the participant which came from the farthest from everywhere, all the way from South Africa. So I'm even a visitor from another continent, and I'm glad to be here learning and exchanging with my Asian counterparts. So with regards to the question, I just want to make a few premises so obviously there is the network of Southern think tanks, which is a big network of different think tanks in the Global South, which have been addressing this issue, but there's also other networks that have also been working on issues on monitoring and evaluation of South-South cooperation. I just want to mention them. Southern Voices is one. Reality of Aid is another one, which has also branches in Manila. So there's many many think tanks, many universities, and many networks in the Global South working on this issue, this very complex issue of evaluation of South-South cooperation. Now, as you have heard many times, South-South cooperation is manifested in many diverse ways. And there's so many different approaches, and different countries see South-South cooperation differently. Hence, the approach to evaluation of South-South cooperation is also quite different. And therefore, there is not one evaluation framework of South-South, there are several. And I can talk to you, there's the way the Asians evaluate South-South cooperation, the way the Africans do, and the Latin Americans measure South-South cooperation is all extremely different. So there's multiple frameworks. Now, to answer your question, is there a particularly Southern approach? I want to also clarify that when we talk about evaluation of South-South cooperation, there are different types and dimensions of evaluation. So there's at least three I would divide up. There is evaluation of quantity and volumes. There is evaluation of the quality and the processes, and then the evaluation of impact and results, these three. So the answer is different for each of these three to your question. With regards to quantity, as the video also said, there is no officially agreed and there's no consensus on the definition. So it's therefore difficult to quantify because nobody knows what are we counting actually. So that we are still far behind in the evaluation community of South-South cooperation in terms of quantity. In terms of quality and processes, this is where probably most progress has been made, in fact, by the network of Southern think tanks. And there is a distinct Southern approach to evaluating South-South cooperation processes and quality of South-South cooperation because South-South cooperation allegedly is different from North-South cooperation based on the principles that have been enunciated in the conferences that were talked about early this morning, Bandung, Buenos Aires, Nairobi. South-South cooperation operates under certain principles, so you can evaluate the application of these principles against reality and to see the compliance of Southern partners to these principles. So using this framework, the network of Southern think tanks has developed a framework to evaluate the quality of South-South cooperation. This has been developed by think tanks all over the Global South, and consensus has been reached on a framework. I'm going to put these copies of this framework if there's a publication table so colleagues can take a copy. So certainly there is a distinct approach to the evaluation. And finally, the third type of evaluation, the evaluation of impact and results, which is ultimately the development outcome. I personally don't think there's much different in the approach to evaluation of North-South cooperation and South-South cooperation when it comes to results and impact, because we all have common goals, which are the SDGs and the goals of our Asian regional frameworks and our national frameworks. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Nissan. I think everyone's quite interested to see what those different approaches are that come from different parts of the world, and certainly I think there's something to be learned from sharing that experience, not only regionally, but across regions. So if Nest is working on that, it's definitely of interest to, I think, everyone here. Taidong, I'd like to turn to you now. There's all eyes are on China all the time, and I think you're probably in the hot seat trying to explain almost every aspect of China's cooperation on a daily basis. We all know about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's kind of major development and investment platform internationally now. But what about as China expands its South-South cooperation, particularly through the BRI? Impact and success must be a growing concern. Definitely it's a global concern, and I think there's a lot of pressure to explain the impact and success. So what does the evaluation framework look like for the Belt and Road Initiative, and how is it being implemented?
Okay, thank you. Let me first to say thanks for ADB and also TIFE Asia Foundation for inviting me to be here. I wanted to take maybe one or two sentences to introduce my organization first, because it's less than 1 year old. It's very new. The name is for Center for International Knowledge on Development. We are similar to KDI, I think. Our mission is to sort of promote development experience studies and exchanges, and then promote international development cooperation. So it's two parts. And in our key missions from the central government, promote global implementation of SDGs is in the official mandate. So I'm really hoping in the future we can work more with ADB, Asia Foundation, and also KDI in the process, since we are a very newcomer, and we have a lot to learn. This, I think, is also about knowledge sharing. So that's my first point. And second point, coming back to your question, I think because BRI is this year we are going to see, it's the 5th anniversary of BRI. Because President Xi Jinping proposed that initiative in 2013, and BRI definitely has attracted a lot of attention from the international communities. We have been doing CIKD since its inauguration early 2017. We have been trying to do some evaluation, but of course the Chinese government is always monitoring and evaluating the initiative, because it's a big initiative. It's had a lot of international attention, and I wanted to first to emphasize is that pilot monitoring and evaluation is always one way of China's own development experience. In the past 40 years, we went to pilot first, and then if it has good effects, we scale up. So we have been following up that approach, I think, in terms of global outreach. So in the BRI, I don't think we have a framework, like a DAC framework or whatever framework for BRI, but we are currently, I think, taking two levels sort of evaluation or monitoring. One is project level, because there are many major BRI projects. So we wanted to see how it was decided, how it was implemented, how it was financed, because BRI has this key principle of consultation, joint implementation, and shared benefits. We want to see, in the process of a project development, whether these key principles are followed. Whether the partner countries are benefiting. So that's sort of one framework. And then the other level is to see, how the BRI are aligned with SDGs. So we are trying to, using the SDG framework, the specific goals, to examine some of the BRI projects. I stop here since the time is.
Thanks, Tadong. I'm sure people have questions, so I've got the app open. So if there are further questions around evaluation and monitoring of the BRI, please send them, and we can discuss them later. I'd like to look at the Korean experience now, Professor Oh. Korea joined the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, in 2010. However, Korea's development approach has features also of contemporary South-South cooperation. So given your experience, I know you're part of the evaluation committee, Committee for International Development that's chaired by the Prime Minister of Korea. How does Korea, as a hybrid between sort of a traditional DAC donor and an SSC partner, how does Korea measure its impact?
Thank you so much for asking me that very interesting question. And also, let me thank the host agencies for having me these very important meetings. Regarding this very special position, there seems to be really good acknowledgement from every other kind of friends in global south. Then many of them, most of them are asking or acknowledging their perspective regarding Korea is one of the country who can be good lesson point and the role model for their development, because of the time span very short regarding our development history is very close to their future. Uh, in that sense, we are very much honored, and then we're feeling kind of special position. However, in Korea side, especially in evaluation committee, there are two very separate point of view. So some of them are really agreeing on that point, that aspect. However, the other position might be more likely to, the Korea need to learn more about the traditional DAC members, what they are doing, and what they are doing for North-South in intervention. So we don't need to export our own history to other global South. That is another point of view. There is little bit tension between them. Line ministry aspect is more like a supporting first idea, but more bilateral agency and also Ministry of Foreign Affairs perspective is more like the latter view. So those two tension or little bit healthy tension might be or contradictory. It can be also good fuel for our finding toward that kind of good real positioning to development society. Maybe I can stop, and then later on I can be more specific.
Thanks for sharing that. I'm sure that that situation of that kind of tension between two methodologies and approaches, and even split across government departments, is not unusual for many of their people looking to evaluate the effectiveness of their programs. Farzana, from the ADB's perspective as a multilateral organization that clearly is invested in evaluation and also in South-South cooperation approaches, how has the increase and expansion of South-South cooperation changed the way that you and your department are approaching evaluation?
Thank you, Anthea, and it's good to see many of the faces from our training yesterday. Well, you know, evaluation began historically in ADB as an accountability function where we had to sort of report on whether money was spent on its intended purposes. But with the SouthSouth cooperation, it has really sort of encouraged ADB to look at evaluation very much in terms of a partnership, which clearly involves the engagement of the countries. And with the partnership came the responsibility of both sides to ensure that development effectiveness has materialized. So while the accountability function remained, South-South cooperation then added the notion of evaluation enhancing knowledge on development effectiveness, and knowledge that was evidence-based both ways. And with that, the need to be more transparent. All of the ADB's evaluation reports are available on the web, and then, of course, the sharing of knowledge. And interestingly enough, that sort of changed the emphasis within ADB as well, because it improved both the, what was the impetus to improve both the internal evaluation that is done within our operations as well as the evaluation done by our own department. But the most important notion was the concept of developing a common evaluation language, because if we are to be able to communicate as evaluators, we need to be able to understand what we are saying. So the concept of, you know, developing evaluation skills at the country level, we have now a very large and expanding evaluation capacity development program. The notion of looking at developing some common ideas around evaluation policies, approaches, and methodologies. So this has been the real emphasis and push now, and the understanding that our reports are only of value if they can be communicated and understood.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think your response really sums up well, I mean, what we've just discussed in this first round of questions, that what's really critical is to look at the skills around evaluation. This is where there is definitely common ground and scope for sharing, you know, the language we use, the approaches and the methodology, what we measure, you know, what we're evaluating, the principles, let's say, of South-South cooperation may differ from North-South cooperation, may differ from region to region, from relationship to relationship, and that's where we see some difference. But there are some essential skills and experience that can be shared across the board. So Manny, now, to our second kind of area of interest around this is knowledge sharing on evaluation. Your organization, of course, is a global expert in this area. tell us, why is it important to share knowledge about evaluations of the effects of development interventions, and particularly in relation to South-South cooperation? And in your experience, what have you seen to be some of the challenges of doing so?
Thanks very much, and I want to thank again the organizers for inviting 3IE and myself to this wonderful event. KDI and the ADB, which is one of our newest members in 3IE, are long-time partners. It's great to actually interact with the Asia Foundation as well for the first time. So very pleased about that. I think it's a great example of East-West cooperation. I noticed that we're all above the equator. Just a couple of observations. I think that we heard in the first panel this morning why it's important to do this kind of evaluation, because there were questions asked about what are the effects of the tremendous amounts of resources that are going to development interventions. And for now over 70 years, and the question I think for evaluation is, what have we learned since then? Are we learning lessons, or are we making the same mistakes? And to do that, evaluation is really key. So that's why this is such a critical part. Let me just mention, in the interest of time, 4 challenges as we see it. Because 3IE, what we do is we support evaluations, but we also do a global landscaping of what is happening, especially, Nissan, on one part you mentioned on impact evaluations. What is the effect on outcomes as opposed to processes and others? One is that there's not enough, there's certainly been a lot of progress made on the number of impact evaluations around the world. We have a data repository of every evaluation that's been done since 1980. Around that time, there were only about 40 or 50 being published every year. Now there are about 400 or 500. The issue is they are concentrated heavily in 4 sectors: education, health, social protection, and agriculture. There's not very much done on infrastructure, energy, environment, areas where either public money is being spent, a lot of public money, and multilateral development bank money, as I was mentioned, or that affects global outcomes, such as climate change. A second challenge is that a lot of the evaluations are still they're about Southern examples, so it really is South-South. Evaluations being done of interventions in developing countries to others, but many of them are still being done from northern-based institutions. And as we noted, a lot more researchers need to be from the South, need to be taken on board, because we think that that actually enhances the relevance of some of these evaluations. The second challenge is, how do we build capacity to generate evidence from the South? A third is that a lot of these evaluations are still not being fully understood by policymakers and decision makers. So there's a challenge not just to build capacity of those who generate the evidence, there's also a challenge to build capacity of those who will use this evidence in actual decision making. And I'd love to hear my colleagues' examples of lessons to address that. And finally, we heard this morning about the issue of cost. Evaluations tend to be costly. There's a fundamental issue in learning itself. It's a public good, because each country has less of an incentive to conduct this kind of learning if others are benefiting from it. Why should you spend money? So it requires a concerted effort internationally, which is why the ADB, I think, is playing such a great role along with KDI to actually make sure that there's international resources going into building up this learning.
Thanks very much. It's fascinating what you just said, that where the most amount of public money is spent in areas like infrastructure, energy, and of course these are priorities for a lot of the countries that are present up here today, that there's very little evidence and evaluation in that area. So, Professor Kim, it's a very good question for KDI and the knowledge sharing program that KDI has championed. How is KDI addressing some of these challenges that Manny just mentioned?
Thank you very much, Anthea. It's a great honor and pleasure to join this distinguished panel consisting of many old friends and and some new friends as well. I realize in this whole we have a gathering of people from different professional backgrounds. Some of us work in knowledge sharing, and some of us are working on evaluation, and I'm sure there are colleagues working on other things as well. And for those of you who are not familiar with 3IE, I'd like to suggest that you pay a short visit to the 3IE website, because it's a wonderful site where you can learn very quickly where the global knowledge frontier lies, in terms of what works and what doesn't, and where the critical knowledge gaps exist. So at KDI school, we have a case studies program. So I have sympathies with those of you who have been working on the knowledge sharing business, and we have a small budding impact evaluation program, and we are not in a position to impart our wisdom in that area. But we try to share our findings through conventional channels like academic journals and stakeholder consultation meetings. But I realize it's very important to feed our findings to an international knowledge aggregator, 3IE Premier an example. Yeah? And I'm very glad that taking advantage of Manny's visit to Seoul this time, we are going to talk about upgrading our membership in 3IE from associate membership to full-fledged institutional membership. I have two quick responses to the list of Manny's challenges, and as I told you, yeah, we are not in a place yet, to think about nurturing our evaluator partners in the partner countries yet. But it has been almost always inevitable, to seek local partners, institutions, to work with in evaluation projects. The second thing I wanted to say is about the need to stimulate the demand for rigorous evaluation, in the development community. I have had the pleasure of serving in the same government committee as Professor Oh, and I'm sure he's going to talk more about that. So I will be very brief. We have realized that just having stems of so-called experts do not make faulty, wasteful evaluations into vigorous evaluations, and we have been making efforts to have the Korean government and the development community take evaluation more seriously, but we realize we still have a long way to go.
Farzana, again from the ADB's multilateral perspective, and how does the ADB leverage its multilateral structure to share lessons on South-South evaluation?
Well, ADB is in a very sort of favored position because we have access to our the evidence that we have from our evaluations across many countries. So we have both the pleasure of having that source of that knowledge, but also a responsibility. So it starts off, with all our products are available on the internet. So that knowledge is shared, both the internal evaluation and the external independent evaluation. The independent evaluation department some time ago tried to understand what would be the key source of knowledge that would actually improve the way the operations worked, and then we looked at the notion of collecting lessons learned, and so we have developed, and it's over now 10 years old now, a lessons database which has the lessons from all the evaluations that we have done over the last 10 years. And this gives an opportunity for people to look at the lessons, and you can access them through you can sort them through by theme, by country, by year, by sector. So it gives an opportunity to understand a little bit of the history, what has happened in the particular area of interest. ADB, of course, also leverages its position as part of the Evaluation Cooperation Group in terms of looking to see how we can work jointly with other development partners. We do undertake joint evaluations both with other development partners as well as with countries themselves, and we encourage on-the-job training within the independent evaluation department itself. And finally, as I mentioned before, we are very active in the area of evaluation capacity development, and through that, again, building the notion that we have to look at ways in which knowledge can be fed back into improving the way we do things better in the future.
It's really good to know, I think, from the answers you can see that there are resources out there that countries can turn to find information, frameworks, experience on evaluation. So we have 3IE, we have KSP and KDI, and we have the ADB. So different kinds of organizations that are functioning at different levels and probably appeal to a range of stakeholders in each one. I'd now like to transition to a big question, an important issue around results. You know, what are the results of some of this evaluation that's been going on South-South cooperation and collaboration? So Nesan, back to you, since you talked about the NEST framework. You've tested it, I know, in several countries, and you yourself were part of some of the evaluations. Can you please describe any results from those evaluations, particularly in relation to knowledge sharing on evaluation?
Yes, so the NEST framework, which I talked about before, has actually been tested and used by different researchers, academics, think tanks in different southern countries to conduct evaluation of South-South cooperation of countries like Mexico, China, India, Turkey, Pakistan, Brazil. I have also one case study here on South Africa, DRC, South-South cooperation and the evaluation of that cooperation based on this framework. In terms of learning and exchange, so at the moment, I have to say that these frameworks are mainly used in the academic space at the moment. It's still it's taking time for the governments to incorporate these frameworks in their own agency operation. But from an academic level, there's certainly a lot of learning and exchange that happens among southern think tanks. We are all peer reviewers of each other's evaluation. So I have peer reviewed an evaluation of my Chinese colleagues of China and Tanzania, or of Mexico and Costa Rica, for instance. So there is certainly learning that happens. We produce books together, reports, journals, and so forth. And we attend conferences like these where knowledge sharing happens, and we share experience and lessons learned. And obviously there's a lot of common challenges and common experiences and results of between southern partners and some diversity. So certainly there is learning and knowledge sharing that happens through these processes within the network of southern think tanks.
Thanks, Nesan. And as he mentioned, he did bring a couple of examples, and we will have those available for those of you to share. Manny, similarly, what have been some of the outcomes of Asian South-South cooperation evaluations to date in terms of the lessons learned from 3IE's perspective?
Yeah, unfortunately, those of us who are into impact evaluations don't have a good example of addressing this issue very rigorously, because we don't know what would have happened without the South-South cooperation. So what we have are case studies and some examples, basically from my own experience. Let me take just one example, because I think it's useful to draw some lessons of what I think has been one of the more successful South-South evaluations. It was basically, though, across regions. In the late 2000s, Asia basically discovered conditional cash transfers, social protection strategy. East Asia in particular has never, this is when I was with the World Bank for many years, never taken social protection as a priority because it was felt that especially transfer programs were dole-outs that might be seen as entitlements and might discourage labor in countries. Latin America discovered conditional cash transfers, which were transfers given to families to encourage them to use the money to actually invest in their children, the human capital that Professor Lee talked about earlier, that's so critical. And that's what enabled, that was evaluated very, very well. The results were very rigorously assessed. And that has actually convinced several Asian countries now, including the country where I was born, the Philippines, to actually scale up its social protection programs. In the past 7 years, it's now reaching 4 million Filipino households from nothing just a few years ago. So just one example of where rigorous evaluations of promising programs can have a real effect.
Thanks, Manny. Yeah, that's an excellent example, and I know that there's many other examples like the conditional cash transfer program that have applicability and relevance, not just in a particular country or continent, but have really spread. Professor O, turning to the health sector, because I know that's your specialization. Health is a very popular area for South-South cooperation. A lot of countries are heavily engaged in sharing their domestic lessons as well as international cooperation on areas like pharmaceuticals and maternal child health, for example. Can you please share one or two key lessons of health sector evaluation for interested Southern providers?
Regarding that, South-South cooperation in health sector is really good example. For example, the human resource development. Cuba is one of the great example. Yeah, having very much different geographical area-based invitation was done to make resource-limited country peoples to become a medical doctor and then to come back again their own countries. That is one kind of Cuba is not a high-income country, but they do that very well. And then in South Korean example, can be one similar example. We are doing kind of inviting many mid-career high-level officials to our countries for having kind of mid-term capacity building courses for health policymaker. Then they certainly if we invite many countries at the same time, they learn it by themselves, each other's, not from only for the South Korean experience, but also their own experience can be shared very well in that program during the 3 or 4 months. And I observed that, and also in the evaluation process, the evaluation result would also say that their learning is not only from the South Korea, but also from the peer countries when they invited. And a similar example can be introduced in the program development in project-based one. For example, one Ghanaian example in terms of primary healthcare system development and strengthening. Ghana is one of the great countries which has very well-knowledged, well acknowledged the primary healthcare system. They call CHIPS. That is very much famous in the world. But the strengthening of that program is now challenging. Then we are South Korea is helping them, while we are helping them. Still, many other country example between South Korea and another low middle income country example can be also integrated that cooperation. So North South cooperation can integrate to South South cooperation as well, so that all the other South neighborhood and even intercontinental neighborhood can be very good resource for the development and then strengthen. Even Ghanaian chips is very famous enough, then still more progress can be done with the South-South cooperation. There is well acknowledged as well. And one the other might be in terms of evaluation. Evidence, as Emmanuel mentioned, that evidence is sometimes not utilized very well in terms of policy decision making, and also China example. The small scale evidence should be positive, and then it can be scaled up. If it's not positive, then we need to reinvent or revise the settings. But most of decision makers' decision in the global south is really not evidence based. That is not my talk. It is the high-level policymakers talk to me. Then they asked us to work together with the high-level academicians to develop more strong evidence. Then if we make that strong evidence, then scale-up can be done by their own tax money or other international grant. So the evidence-based policy making, especially in health sector, that is greatly requested. Then when I was doing that with my colleagues in Vietnam, then Hanoi Medical University and Hanoi University of Public Health, that high-level academicians working with our Seoul National University so eagerly, then that small-scale evidence production was now going with the Cambodian colleagues and the Lao colleagues together. Then those North-South cooperation can be, hopefully, that evidence production can be really be useful for decision making, as Emmanuel mentioned. So that's my the point to share.
Yeah, thank you. I think, two really good points that came out of that is one, the challenge of how do you transition from producing kind of anecdotal type evidence to really kind of hard evidence around what works and what doesn't, and the capacity building that's required to do that. But also, interestingly, the importance of, beyond bilateral knowledge sharing. So the example you gave of, several countries coming together, maybe to look at experiences from Korea, but a lot of the knowledge sharing was between those countries that were participating, and I think we often forget about that. We think about the bilateral sharing, whereas there is often much more sort of cross-fertilization of ideas that go on. So turning to capacity building now, since you mentioned it, Taidong, we know that China's human resource capacity to manage its large South-South cooperation programs like the BRI has really not kept up with the pace of its economic expansion, which has been rapid and huge. So how will the establishment of the new agency, the China International Development Cooperation Agency, how will that agency address these capacity issues, especially in terms of evaluation? And I will also note that someone from the audience also asked that same question, so I think we're interested to learn more about the new agency.
Thank you, Anthea. On the new agency, I think maybe many of us know it was just established in April this year. It's one of the part of the new sort of government reshuffle in China. I think monitoring and evaluation is going to be an important function of this new agency, because I think in the past China has not done well in terms of either domestic explanation or internationally, advocacy in terms of its contribution to sort of like development agenda. So likely, I think we are going to have a independent sort of evaluation department in the new agency, and then I think they will be trying to develop a sort of evaluation framework, which I can talk a little bit later. I think the framework will be maybe different from, at least from what the DAC is doing. And then the third part definitely is to involving more third parties, like the Chinese think tanks or some of the international organizations in the evaluation. So one of the initiatives is, current initiative is like to work with UNDP to do some case studies on China's, the aid projects. But I think there are, for me personally, I think there are some big challenges. First, I think it's about, maybe Nathan also knows that it's about sort of objectives and principles, because China's aid is under this South-South cooperation. And then, among the many principles of this initiative, there's this demand-driven and also mutual benefit, right? So when we are doing evaluation, how to consider these sort of two key fundamental principles. So I think that's sort of one key challenges. And then the second one is sort of on discourse or language, or sort of alignment with international discourse. So we are all talking about development effectiveness, at least in the development cooperation community, in the community we are within today. But I don't think in the Chinese policy making community, there's this word, we call it development effectiveness, because they don't know what development effectiveness is. Personally, I don't know what development effectiveness means, because it may come to, in the end, what do we mean by development? In China, I think, when we are talking about development, at least from the history, from the past 4 decades, we are talking about economic growth. It's definitely different from, what we are talking about here about development. So that's also a big, I think, challenge. And then I think evaluation is very costly. We all know that. And capacity building, of course, is a long process. But there's also, I think, the fourth sort of challenge is the Chinese way of doing aid. We are not that unique, but I think it's very special, because aid comes with trade, with investment. Oftentimes, we don't know where is the boundary, and oftentimes, aid and investment is under one package. I mean, looking at the PRI, it's many financial, different financial tools into one big project. If we are looking at, Pakistan, the CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, if we are looking at the China-Laos Railway, and also many of the Cambodia projects, it's not aid. It's aid, it's concessional loans, it's commercial loans, it's loans from, other Chinas. So how you are going to assess the effectiveness, or if we are using the 5 criteria of DAX, how you are going to monitor that specific part of the aid part, or you are doing a package way. So it's a lot of challenges, I think, we needed to consider.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I think you've really highlighted the key challenge around evaluation in this area, because South-South cooperation is much more than aid, and beyond aid in many ways. And I think that's why our discussion is particularly important. How do we measure all these other aspects, not be confined by the traditional language of just measuring aid and development cooperation. Your agency clearly has a big challenge ahead. I think we'll all be looking to see what kind of results come out of the deliberations internally, and what kind of frameworks China puts forward to look at measuring the impact of all these various components that are definitely outside and beyond of an aid framework. Professor Kim, capacity building is a pillar of the knowledge sharing program, KSP's approach. And how can KSP work with South-South cooperation providers to enhance their evaluation skills, perhaps address some of the issues that Taidong mentioned?
In the previous round, I overused my time. Maybe to compensate, I can be very brief. Yeah, I think capacity building, within Korea, overseas will be a very important function that KDI can play. Your question is a very opportune one for us at this stage, because we have this new facility. KDI used to use this as the main campus. We have relocated, to a new government city in Sejong, and the government kindly allowed us to reoccupy for new set of goals. And my colleagues at KDI running this center are in search of program ideas, and I think capacity building for evaluation purposes would be a very good topical area. And I know my colleagues are keen in search of international partners as well. And it occurred to me that ADB and 3IE can be good partners for the venture.
So I think that's an invitation and a call to action on the part of this new institute to take on the challenge of doing some capacity building around South-South cooperation evaluation. So thank you for that. The last set of questions, I just want to ratchet it up one level to look at the big picture. What are we evaluating and for what purpose? And to look at the SDGs. So first, same question that I'm going to ask Farzana first, then Taidong, and then Professor Kim. How can or are your institutes aligning your South-South cooperation evaluation approaches with with the SDGs. The SDGs really have been embraced by South-South cooperation providers, China in particular, as well as India. Across the board, I think post-MDG, we really saw countries from all over the world, northern, southern providers really embracing the SDGs and aligning their strategies with them. So it really provides an opportunity. Farzana, what's your approach to that?
Yes, thank you for the question. The notion of SDGs links. We've been discussing evaluation frameworks, and we were just discussing a minute ago that you really can't be talking about evaluation frameworks unless you have a sort of results framework to evaluate. So unless you actually have a clear common objective of what are the results we're trying to achieve, then evaluation becomes quite difficult. SDGs are, in a sense, have made life easier because they represent the common results that have been internationally agreed, driven by countries, so we're told. So in a sense, countries have adopted that. From the ADB perspective, there are two ways that we're looking at it. First of all, of course, we are totally committed to the capacity development of countries in terms of building their evaluation capacity to understand where they stand with respect to the SDG targets. But in addition, the ADB through its own projects has embedded the SDG indicators and targets. So when we do our projects now, we have to sort of indicate which SDG target that we are what SDG goal that we're targeting. And then, of course, from the evaluation perspective, we look to see whether or not those targets have been achieved, and then that provides a means for us to accumulate across our own organization to see how much we have contributed to that. So perhaps I'll leave it at that at the moment.
As I mentioned before, I think our new institution is mandated sort of to promote a global implementation of SDGs. So I think we are addressing this issue like two ways. Domestically, we are working with the different ministries to sort of monitoring the progress of China's own implementation of the SDGs. Last August, we issued the first government sort of national progress report on China's implementation of SDGs. Although it's very not that evidence-based, but I think it's a lot of about like sort of policy reorientation, next steps, all the stuff. And also through that process, we are pushing forward the different ministries to to sort of raise awareness, to push forward the different ministries to incorporate SDG agenda into its own policy making process. So that's, I think, domestically. And then internationally, one part is, I mentioned it before, is like we are trying to align the SDG framework with BRI. We are trying to, when we are doing many of the case studies, we are also talking about case studies. We have finished 3. We wanted to see how they are affecting the SDG goals, or in partner countries and also in China. So this, I think, like in general, 2 approaches. But I think SDG is very broad. Many of the goals, needs to be compromised. If you are doing this, you may compromise the other goals. So it's a lot of, I think, big issues in this process, and we needed to make a choice.
Going back to the observation that we have a get together in this hall of people working in different work streams. I think I wanted to share my thoughts about what we can do together, across the professional divides, for the attainment of the SDGs. SDGs are ambitious goals, but they are urgent goals at the same time. In that we could save a lot of human suffering, and because the goals are ambitious, we need to make all kinds of efforts, and South-South cooperation, knowledge cooperation are very important ventures, and doing that. I think we need to encourage cross-fertilization between knowledge sharing and the evaluation ventures. Yeah, and maybe I can illustrate my point with an example of a South Korean rural development model. You know, maybe many of you have heard about this, and I know one colleague, a good friend of mine, Mr. Ed Reed, from the Asia Foundation, who's perhaps sick of hearing about it again, because that topic has been a controversial one in South Korea. But earlier we talked about conditional cash transfers, and we are all familiar with the concept of community-driven development. And I think of the Korean model of a CDD as a marriage between CCT and community-driven development, right? So we have the conventional components of CDD in the Semaul Korean model. So top bottom up participation of the village community members, but there is a component of conditional community transfer. If a community succeeds in meeting targets, then there is a bonus money for the community to invest in communal projects. And I have had the pleasure of reading survey paper by World Bank economists, Biju and Mansouri, and there are billions of dollars getting spent on CDD projects, and the assessment is quite mixed. In spite of the great promises, the evaluation results are quite mixed. And Professor Oh earlier talked about the tension within the South Korean development cooperation community about two different approaches, right? We do what others do versus let's think about what has worked better in South Korea and try to share the experience with development partners overseas. And the idea of Semaul Undong is a controversial one, even in South Korea. We have gone through a lot of tumultuous events in South Korea. You remember, the impeachment of the former president, and this rural development idea is closely associated with her father, the late President Park Chung-hee. So some people have great things to say in terms of anecdotes about the Semaul experiences. Others are very critical of that, and Mr. Reed has written about it from a critical perspective. He was a Peace Corps volunteer working in rural villages in Korea when I was a small kid in primary school. So the point is, nobody seems to know for sure whether it has worked in South Korea. Whether it will work, in overseas settings is even greater question. So I'm very glad. I was very glad that we have been able to cooperate with COICA and the government of Myanmar, right? To do it in a systematic way, to try and see whether the additional feature in the CDD model, inspired by the Korean experiences, can be shown to work. So because of the change in the government, we were quite worried that the new administration might just scrap the commitment, right? But that didn't happen because of happy meeting between Do Aung San Suu Kyi and our President Moon Jae-in. Because Do Aung San Suu Kyi had seen great responses from her countrymen. She thanked President Moon Jae-in for doing this great thing in Myanmar. So, but the results are not in yet. So we are, quite anxious about the results, and we would be glad to share the results. And that's an illustration. But I think there are things we can do, going beyond the divide between case studies and evaluations. And I think about evaluations inspired by anecdotal evidence, insights in case studies, and also case studies inspired by great evaluation results in some projects to enliven, right, the audience interest in certain implementation aspects of great projects, for instance. So I think there are things that can be done better in that area. I'm going to stop here, but maybe I have some more things to say in response to the field audience interventions.
Thank you. I think the Sema Udong experience of Korea is one of those classic examples of things that could be shared across other countries. So okay, the last kind of provocative question that I'm going to ask our three remaining panelists, and I want your gut feel about this, is are South-South cooperation and North-South cooperation evaluations converging or diverging? And in your opinion, which way do you think it should go? So I want short, punchy answers since we are out of time and we want to turn to the audience. So I'll start with Professor Oh, and then go to Nishan, and then finally to Manny.
Yeah. Let me respond as your expectation. So I was thinking it should be converged, because there is no reason to be diverse and then diversified because of the technical reason. However, once we think more about the development, the ultimate goal of development, then also ultimate goal of development evaluation need to serve for the achieving development finally. So that in terms of project or program level, then technically the science-based scientific evaluation should be critical, so crucial, so that there is no reason to be diverse, so that converging might be the answer. So that's one simple answer. However, once we look at North-South evaluation, then do we think it is really optimal enough? Then nobody will answer yes. So that then what is the room to be improved? That can be our question. So that if South-South evaluation is following North-South evaluation, then they have the same limitation. So how can overcome that? That can be our real question. Then, if North-South evaluation is kind of one of trajectory, then it cannot be converged in terms of South-South evaluation. So that what can be difference? If we go to the constraint of evaluation, there are some data constraint, the financial constraint, and then the time constraint, the political constraint, many things. However, that financial or the time or resource, the human resource constraint, that can be similar in South-South, even more. However, political constraint might be little different. So that the reason the North-South cooperation's evaluation is hampered might be global North kind of political willingness, weakness of political willingness. That can be, for example, European countries and World Bank and ADB is very enthusiastic to evaluate the result. However, the rest of the global North is not really eager to do that. So considering that, South-South cooperation might be following the real evaluations, making that useful to ultimately achieve their real development. Once we are follower of the kind of developmentalism or modernization theorist, then might be we are support of the North-South evaluation follower, then converging. However, if we doubt that is really the truth, such as dependent theory or world system theorist, even we are not fully support of that theorist, still, if we doubt that developmentalism is a perfect one, then maybe South-South evaluation might be strategically different. I don't know how should be different, but technically I don't know. However, strategically maybe it should be different to get ultimate development.
So yes and no is how you've answered. It's complicated. Nason.
I'm going to answer with 2 comments and a recommendation of what I would suggest, which involves 2 of my fellow panelists, actually, my recommendation. So my comment of convergence. Now, I'm both evaluation and SouthSouth cooperation. You can look at it at a technical level, but they're extremely political, both also. So, as a technician, as an academic, as a development practitioner, my approach is very technical and scientific. And under that aspect, for me, there's no major difference in the evaluation. But if you would ask a diplomat or a government official from the G77 or the BRICS country, they will tell you, no, you cannot use the same evaluation approaches for South-South cooperation as the OECD and the northern ones, because they are very, ideologically different, and so we need a new system. So it's politicized, but from a technical level, I think there's no major differences. What I have to say about this is, frankly speaking, some of the greatest economists, some of the greatest evaluators of our history and our currently, who have developed and taken forward the so-called OECD traditional evaluation system, are actually evaluators from the South, are South Asians, Indians, Pakistanis, that actually look, the head of 3IE, one of the toughest evaluation networks in the world, is from the South. So I think we have to also tone down the political rhetoric and see that actually the South is contributing even to the mainstream evaluation systems. And one recommendation I have to move this forward is, Manny mentioned that there is not enough rigorous impact evaluations on South-South cooperation. That's the reality. And the truth is that there are a lot of impact evaluations done in the global South, particularly in those 4 sectors that he mentioned. But they're all of national policies, big national policies and programs of social protection, of health and education. And the reason why you don't have strong, big impact evaluations of South-South is because South-South cooperation is often a very small project of knowledge exchange. And as my panelists mentioned, the cost of impact evaluation, the time required, is so high that it becomes more expensive to do the evaluation than actually the project itself. But I think now we have a possibility to change things with the BRI project, for example. China is investing huge amounts of money in international cooperation, building infrastructure that changes the lives of people in other countries. So my recommendation is for 3IE to cooperate with China as it implements the BRI, to do rigorous impact evaluations of the BRI projects, on the life of people in Myanmar, in Pakistan, of China's infrastructure development in terms of provision of energy. And I think this is an opportunity that could be explored by networks like 3IE and China, which is a big now provider of South-South cooperation. The only thing is, Manny, don't bring in North American evaluators to do it. Use your Indian, your Chinese, your Latin economists that you have who know how to do good RCTs to do impact evaluation of South-South cooperation. So we eliminate all the politics, and also countries like China accept these forms of technical. So that's my way forward.
Well, you're on the hot seat now, Manny. What's your response?
Thank you. Wow, what did I think of that? Nishan, thanks very much. You're not only a great evaluator, you're a great matchmaker. So I'll be talking to Taedong, I hope, to undertake this. Just on the broader question, I think that you raised, Anthea, on convergence. Just 2 things. I do think that the North-South and South-South is converging. In fact, the North is learning a lot of lessons from the South, more and more. So let's take again the Conditional Cash Transfer Program. New York City has asked for technical assistance from other organizations, which will go unnamed, to actually implement a Conditional Cash Transfer Program for its youth programs in the Bronx. Okay? And that is completely inspired by the Mexican and Latin American program. So just one example that in fact is converging. The other side of the coin, however, is that is this a great thing yet? If you think about the number of northern governments that are really evidence-based, I fear a little bit for the future. because of course that comes and goes. There are some that are, and so we might be converging towards a lower common denominator, as we see one very large northern country, for example, where alternative truths are now becoming more the policy than the norm, is a bit of a concern. So there is convergence, but it might be at a lower level than we like. The other concern that I have is this development assistance takes on, is now integrated with commercial and strategic interests of the donor partners. It becomes less likely that those agencies will want to share knowledge because of the strategic and commercial interests. And so there's just two caveats. There is convergence, but there are challenges.
Thanks so much. That's the end of our round of questioning, and I'd like to thank all the panelists for excellent answers and very succinct ones, and we pretty much kept to time, so thank you very much. I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience right now, and actually the first question is a really good segue just from the discussion we've been having, and it's for Taidong, the first question from the audience. So someone from the audience asked, how open is China to evaluation findings and results? Particularly, let's say, if they were done by an external party.
So we are talking about SouthSouth Corporation evaluation findings, right? I don't think that is very open. I think this is a big issue, complex issue, and a big issue for China. We have several reasons, I think. One is sort of the domestic public opinion, I think, which is now getting stronger and stronger with the BRI moving ahead. It's like, you know, the public is not that satisfactory of Chinese government spending so much money abroad, because frankly, we do have, I think many of the ADB colleagues would know, China is facing serious development challenges inside. Unemployment issues, economic development issues, debt issues, all inside. So on that part, I think that is why the lack of transparency issues. The other part, I think, of course, we can be very frank, is to manage the complex. I think for China to manage the complex relationship with the developing countries, all the rest of the developing countries. Because China is constrained in many ways, in terms of, Taiwan issue, in terms of many of the Tibet issue, many of the, our diplomatic issues, China is constrained, and then they are coming to, and also, I mean, we can see, South China issues, it's frank. So there are many, I think, diplomatic issues that also constrain the transparency part. How we are going to say, if you are giving 1 million to Myanmar, why you are giving 2 million to Cambodia? All this kind of, I think, it's a very practical and realistic problem. So, and then when it comes to evaluation results, like what I mentioned, because the objective is very complex. The SouthSouth Corporation objective is multidimensional. It's not a one. It's not a one dimension. Then from which angle, from what entry point you are going to evaluate that, it's a fundamental issue. It's not like a simple issue. We are saying we are spending 5 million, and then we are saying this is changing the life of 1,000 people or 2,000 people. I don't think that is simple.
Okay, thanks. Related question, Manny. Someone from the audience also asked, what are the reasons why 3IE or others are not conducting impact evaluations on infrastructure?
That's a great question. I think there are a number of reasons for this. One is hard evidence is really hard in some sectors relative to others. So when you have big national programs like dams, in which there are a lot of political interests at stake, there's not as much demand for this kind of work. And another is so it's both technical as well as political. It doesn't mean that they cannot it's impossible to address them. There have been some examples. It's just a lot more difficult, which I think means that we have to make a greater effort to trying to make sure that those countries like China and organizations like ADB and World Bank and others who put a lot of money into infrastructure demand more of this work.
I just want to do a quick check-in with Saleha on the time, because I've got, it says here I have, okay, good, okay, so I'll take a few more questions. I'm going to take one question from the audience before I go back to the list. Does anyone have one there? Yes, sir.
I'm Ganapati Oja from Community of Evaluators South Asia, and I'm Nepali national. Maybe my question goes to ADB. This is regarding the national capacity development. National capacity development means it's not only the development of the government capacity. As far as SDGs are concerned, because SDGs are very complex and they demand inputs, energy, not only from the government but also from the non-government actors. Therefore, enhancing the capacity, national capacity means that other actors, including the government actors, should be included into the process of capacity development. How it's now ADB is concentrating or exclusively working only with the government in this capacity development aspect also. What is your future plan to include non-state actors in the capacity development?
I'm going to take a few questions. So there's and then panelists can decide if they'd like to respond. One more question is, what is one lesson we should remember when evaluating knowledge exchange programs? What is one lesson we should remember when evaluating knowledge exchange programs? That wasn't directed to anyone in particular. And here's one more. What are some specific indicators on how effective knowledge transfer programs? And how do these indicators actually capture results? And I'll take one last question from the floor, if anyone has one. Yes, Doctor, go ahead. Just shout.
We earlier discussed about political suitability of the need of evaluation, but I want to take a slightly different side, which is say local partners' point of view. So maybe local policymakers may put a lot of political asset at stake by allowing for this partnership, and maybe they may not have a political resources to suffer from or managing no impact or no positive impact of such a partnership. So is there any way that could provide some safe ground to the local partners that they can adapt this potentially no or negative impact of the evaluation but move on to a more developed program in the future?
Thank you. Okay. Please don't answer every question. Farzana, I'm going to turn to you first because I think there was an ADB specific question. Please go ahead.
Yes, I think that's a very, very important question. And I think from the ADB perspective, there's a clear recognition from the institution that development effectiveness involves a range of partners, just not the government, but also civil society, as well as including the private sector. So when it comes to capacity development, particularly, I think you might have been thinking about civil society approaches. Well, ADB has many avenues in which that development takes place. It starts off by the issue of sharing knowledge transparently. ADB has a website where all our projects and our evaluation products are available for everyone to see and comment on. There is an NGO center which actively interacts with the NGO community through a protocol of interaction to ensure that the NGO community is engaged. We have a complaints mechanism through which people can respond when they have concerns about ADB projects. In terms of what the independent evaluation department does, which might be of interest, we do not specifically engage on capacity development with non-government entities, though we do engage in the knowledge sharing. For example, we invite non-government partners to events like the Asian Evaluation Week or our capacity development programs as experts. So if there's a capacity development to take place of the NGO institutions themselves, it would happen through our operations or through the NGO center.
Thanks. Yeah, Nathan, go ahead.
I'll take the question on the knowledge exchange. I think one of the big challenges about measuring South-South cooperation is because much of South-South cooperation is not about transfer and movement of money, like North-South cooperation. It's about movement of people and exchange between people and knowledge. And that's much more intangible and more difficult to measure and quantify. Hence, when you talk about South-South, you talk about knowledge exchange, you talk about technology transfer, you talk about technical cooperation, all of these extremely difficult to measure. So that, just to give you an example, you have Cuban doctors coming to Africa, and then you have Norwegian doctors. The value of Norwegian doctors is much higher because their salary and their income and is higher, but doesn't mean that the Norwegian doctor is better than the Cuban doctor. So the South-South cooperation, sometimes it's problematic to monetize and to compare with North-South cooperation. But I think we in NEST, when we try to look at measuring this, I think we can learn a lot from the monitoring and evaluation of capacity building because it's very similar, and learning. So I think if we want to measure the impact, the results, I think it's not just about how many people you trained or how many countries you work with. It's about what how that translated in learning and application, and what behavior changed or what institutional changes have been as a result of that exchange. Because you could introduce a technology, you can introduce and you can brag about it, but if nothing changes as a result of that. But then if you do something simple, as in sharing some knowledge that you have developed, and by that country applying that in policy, in institutions, in behavior, changes drastically, that is a huge impact with a very small investment. So I think we need to learn how to, in terms of the indicators, look more on the indicators of that look at the application of knowledge into and the behavioral change and institutional change as a result of that knowledge transfer, whether it's through training, whether through exchanges, and so forth. I think that's the area we need to explore.
Let me try to address be a little bit courageous here and address the political question that was that was asked. I think that if you frame the evaluation as existential to a program, it is going to be very controversial. If there's a vested interest in billions of dollars already having been spent on a road, and your evaluation question is that road successful, a yes or no, I don't think that evaluation will ever be done. But if the question is more instrumental, what are better ways that road could have been built, then I do think there are examples in which those kind of evaluations have worked. It is less threatening and will tend to be taken up.
I'd like to take up the question about the evaluation of knowledge sharing programs. I'm sure whoever has managed a knowledge sharing program has worried about evaluation of performance reporting. And I remember having a conversation with a former Asia Foundation country representative in South Korea, Mr. David Steinberg. Earlier this morning, Mr. Hein gave us many examples of excellent programs the Asia Foundation is engaged in countries in Asia. In South Korea, we have strong memories, national memories of the good things the foundation did for us in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Yeah, and when I had a chance to meet Mr. Steinberg, who was active in the 1970s in South Korea, how did you cope with, the demand from the government, to manage your performance, right? How do you come up with indicators? How do you measure your performance in knowledge sharing programs and so forth? And his response was we couldn't have done it under the current environment because back then, there was no stringent demands, for performance management from the U.S. Congress and so forth, right? And I think we are all struggling to get it done because we need to get it done somehow. But based on my experience so far, so for example, we have a program of 2-week training program for Indian civil servants. They have been sending 100 of their civil servants every year, for the past 11 years, and they do it repeatedly, and they pay for it. They insist on paying for it because South Korea is not one of the G7 countries, and India cannot accept, ODA help from a small country like Korea. And when the smart people in the Indian government, keeps doing this, I'm sure, they do that because of good reasons, right? But it has been a challenge to think of convincing ways, to evaluate performance, record performance, the results of the great program. But when it comes at the end of the day, I think what needs to happen in performance management in knowledge sharing programs is to maintain ties with the former beneficiaries of the training programs and try your best, to collect, success stories, powerful personal witnesses, because that's what we are after in knowledge sharing programs after all. And I'm sure this is not a very satisfactory answer, but based on my experiences, that's the best I could come up with.
Thanks very much, and we have 1 minute to go, and I'd just like, oh, sorry, go, sorry, Taidong, you have 30 seconds.
No, for the lessons, I think, on knowledge sharing program, I think for us, maybe this is very provocative, but I think don't preach should be one of the lessons, because personally, I have a long experience of doing development programs with even MDBs, UN agencies. But that is why also when I was advising my colleagues at the different ministries, I was a little bit concerned whether we should develop a unified framework for evaluation. Because when you are having a unified framework, you are bringing it to the different partner countries. And it's very dangerous, I think, because many times it doesn't work. And it makes we are bringing some standards. So, but don't preach. I think that's definitely one lesson, and I would hope my colleagues, even with China is giving more, we can remember that.
Thank you. Those are good words to end on. I'll just wrap up by saying that I think one of the key takeaways from this session is that, we often think about evaluation as purely a technical exercise, but I think the discussion has really revealed that equally important, if not more important, is the political aspect of that exercise, particularly when it comes to South-South cooperation, which is very political in its nature. And not only political, but also financial. The resources that are required to do the evaluation is also a critical factor. So perhaps if we give a bit more consideration to those two aspects, we may see some more opportunities for collaboration, let's say between North and South, between regions, between partners and countries, maybe not convergence, but at least more participation and collaboration on SSC evaluation. Please join me in thanking all our panelists for some very valuable insights into this issue.